My name is Niran. I'm 71 years old, and I'm going to tell you something tonight that I've never said out loud to anyone. For most of my life, I wasn't living my own life. I was living the life my thoughts told me I had to live. I wasn't making my own choices. My thoughts were making them for me. I wasn't feeling my own feelings. I was feeling what my thoughts told me I should feel. And the most terrifying part of all of this is that I had no idea it was happening. I thought the voice in my head was me. I thought the endless stream of commentary, criticism, worry, and judgment was simply who I was. I thought everyone lived this way, trapped inside their own minds, controlled by an invisible force they couldn't name and didn't know how to escape. It took me until I was 53 years old to understand that I was a prisoner, and the prison, the walls, the chains, the locked doors, all of it was made of thought, nothing but thought. And tonight I want to share with you 5 signs that your thoughts are controlling you. 5 patterns I lived with for decades without recognizing them. Because if you can see these patterns in yourself, if you can recognize what's happening, that recognition is the crack that lets the light in. That recognition is the beginning of freedom. The first sign is one I lived with every single day for 40 years without knowing it was a sign of anything. You believe every thought you have is true. This sounds so simple when I say it now, so obvious, but it wasn't obvious then. Every thought that entered my mind, I accepted it as fact, as reality, as truth. If my mind said I wasn't good enough, I believed I wasn't good enough. I didn't question it. I didn't examine the evidence. I didn't ask myself where this thought came from or whether it was accurate. I just believed it, completely, automatically. The same way you believe the sky is blue when you look up and see it. If my mind said someone was angry with me, I believed someone was angry with me. Even if they hadn't said anything, even if they hadn't done anything, even if there was no evidence at all except the thought itself. The thought was enough. The thought was proof. The thought was reality. And here's what made this so devastating. My mind produced thousands of thoughts every single day. Most of them were not true. Most of them were interpretations, assumptions, projections, fears dressed up as facts. But I treated every single one as if it were the absolute truth, as if my mind was some kind of infallible oracle that only spoke wisdom, when in reality, my mind was more like a machine that never stopped running, churning out thought after thought after thought, most of them repetitive, many of them negative, almost none of them as true as they felt. I was living in a world constructed entirely by my own thinking, and I believed that world was reality. I couldn't see the difference between what was actually happening and what my mind said was happening. And that inability to distinguish between reality and thought created a suffering so deep, so constant, that I forgot what it felt like to be at peace. The breakthrough came when I started asking a question I had never asked before. A question so simple it seems almost stupid to say out loud. But this question changed everything. The question was this: is this thought true? Not does it feel true, not does it seem true, but is it actually, factually, verifiably true? And when I started applying this question to the thoughts that tormented me most, I made a discovery that shook the foundation of everything I believed. Most of them weren't true, not even close. They were stories, interpretations, worst-case scenarios, memories distorted by time and emotion, predictions that had no basis in reality. And I had been believing all of it, obeying all of it, building my entire life around thoughts that were nothing more than mental fiction. The second sign is something I avoided for most of my life without even realizing I was avoiding it. You can't sit in silence without becoming anxious. Silence terrified me. I didn't know that's what it was at the time. I just knew that I always needed noise, music, television, conversation, activity, anything to fill the space, anything to keep me from being alone with myself. Because when there was no external noise, the internal noise became unbearable. When there was nothing to distract me, all the thoughts I had been running from came rushing to the surface. All the feelings I had been pushing down came flooding up, and it was too much, too overwhelming, too painful to face. So I structured my entire life to avoid silence. I woke up to an alarm and immediately turned on the radio. I filled my days with tasks and obligations and interactions. I kept myself so busy that there was never a moment to just be, to just sit, to just exist without doing. And at night, when I finally had to lie down, I would distract myself until the last possible moment. Television, reading, anything to postpone the moment when I had to turn off the lights and face the darkness and the thoughts that lived there. Looking back now, I can see what I couldn't see then. The inability to sit in silence is one of the clearest signs that your thoughts have taken over. Because if your mind is at peace, silence is not threatening. Silence is restful. Silence is where you return to yourself. But if your mind is full of noise, if your thoughts are controlling you, silence becomes the thing you fear most. Because in silence, you have to hear them. You have to feel them. You have to face what you've been running from. And if you've been running for long enough, if you've been avoiding for long enough, what waits for you in the silence can feel like it will destroy you. But here's what I learned after finally forcing myself to sit in silence and face what was there. It doesn't destroy you. It never does. What destroys you is the running, the avoiding, the constant effort to escape from yourself. The silence, when you finally surrender to it, is not your enemy. It's your teacher. It shows you what you've been carrying. It reveals the thoughts that have been running your life from the shadows. And once you can see them, Once you can hear them clearly without distraction, they begin to lose their power. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, inevitably. Because consciousness is the antidote to unconscious control. Awareness is the key that unlocks the prison. If you're beginning to see yourself in these words, if you're recognizing patterns you've never named before, I want you to know that this recognition is everything. You're not broken. You're not weak. You're human. And the fact that you're here, listening to this, searching for understanding, tells me that something in you is ready. Ready to see, ready to know, ready to change. Stay with that readiness. It will guide you to exactly where you need to go. The third sign is one that controlled my emotional life for decades before I understood what was happening. Your emotions change based on your thoughts rather than reality. This is subtle. This is hard to see when you're inside it. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I would be having a perfectly fine day. Nothing bad was happening. I was safe. I was healthy. The people I loved were okay. And then a thought would arise. A thought about something that happened 5 years ago. A thought about something that might happen next month. A thought that had nothing to do with what was actually occurring in that moment. And my entire emotional state would shift. Instantly, completely. A thought about a mistake I made years ago would fill me with shame, as fresh and raw as if I had just made it. A thought about a future possibility, something that hadn't happened and might never happen, would fill me with anxiety, as real as if I were in actual danger. My emotions were not responding to reality. They were responding to my thoughts about reality. And those two things, I learned, are completely different. Reality is what is actually happening right now, in this moment, in this room, in this body. Thoughts are the mind's commentary on reality, the mind's predictions, the mind's memories, the mind's interpretations. And when you can't tell the difference, when your emotional system treats thoughts as if they were real events, you end up living in a constant state of reactivity. You end up suffering over things that aren't happening. You end up anxious about futures that never arrive. You end up grieving pasts that cannot be changed. You end up missing the only moment where life actually exists, because you're too busy reacting to thoughts about moments that don't exist. I remember a specific example that showed me this pattern so clearly I couldn't deny it anymore. I was sitting in my garden on a beautiful morning. The sun was warm, the birds were singing. I had nowhere I needed to be, nothing urgent demanding my attention. It should have been peaceful. It should have been lovely. But I was miserable, completely miserable, because my mind was replaying an argument I'd had with a friend 3 days earlier, going over what she said, what I said, what I should have said, what she probably thought of me now, building an entire story about how the friendship was ruined, how she would never forgive me, how I had destroyed something precious through my stupidity. And none of this was happening. Not in reality. In reality, I was sitting in a garden on a beautiful morning. But in my mind, I was in crisis. And my body, my emotions, my entire experience of that moment was being determined not by the reality, but by the thought. When I finally saw this, when I finally understood that I was suffering over a story my mind was telling rather than over anything actually happening, something shifted. I started paying attention to what was real versus what was thought. I started asking myself, in moments of emotional distress, what is actually happening right now? Not what happened yesterday, not what might happen tomorrow. What is happening right now, in reality, in this present moment? And almost always, the answer was nothing. Nothing terrible was happening. The terrible thing was only in my head, only in my thoughts. And that distinction, that simple distinction between thought and reality, began to free me from a prison I had been living in without knowing it existed. The fourth sign is something I did constantly for most of my life, without recognizing how much energy it was consuming. You argue with reality. You fight with what has already happened. Something occurs, a result you didn't want, a situation you didn't choose, an outcome you can't accept. And instead of acknowledging it and moving forward, you argue with it in your mind. You resist it. You insist it shouldn't have happened. You replay it over and over, trying to make it different in your head. This shouldn't have happened. This isn't fair. Why did this happen to me? How could this have happened? What if it had gone differently? What if I had done something else? The questions loop endlessly. The resistance never stops. The fighting never ceases. And here's the cruelty of this pattern. The event is already over. It's done. It's in the past. It cannot be changed. Not by thinking about it. Not by arguing with it. Not by wishing it were different. It happened. That's reality. But your thoughts refuse to accept this. Your thoughts insist on fighting battles that have already been lost. And every moment you spend arguing with what has already happened is a moment of suffering you're creating for yourself. You're making yourself suffer twice, once from the event itself, and again, often for much longer, from your refusal to accept that the event occurred. I wasted years of my life doing this, arguing with history, debating with facts, fighting with reality, as if my mental resistance could somehow change what had already happened. It couldn't. It never can. All it did was keep me stuck, keep me trapped in the past, keep me from moving forward into whatever was trying to come next. Because I was too busy fighting what was behind me to see what was in front of me. The energy that could have gone into healing went into resisting. The attention that could have gone into the present went into rehearsing the past. And the result was years of my life spent in a mental prison, arguing with a reality that never argued back. Because reality doesn't argue. Reality just is. And no amount of mental resistance changes that. Learning to stop arguing with reality was one of the hardest things I've ever done. because it felt like giving up. It felt like saying that what happened was okay. But that's not what acceptance means. Acceptance doesn't mean you think something was right or good or fair. Acceptance means you acknowledge that it happened, that it's real, that it's in the past and cannot be changed, and that your energy is better spent dealing with what is rather than fighting what was. This shift, this move from resistance to acceptance freed up an enormous amount of energy. Energy I didn't even know I had been using. Energy that became available for actually living instead of mentally arguing. The fifth sign is perhaps the most profound and the most difficult to explain. You've forgotten who you are beneath the thinking. This is the sign that tells you the thoughts have completely taken over. When you have been identified with your thoughts for so long that you no longer remember there is a you separate from them. For most of my life, I had no idea I was not my thoughts. I believed my thoughts were me. My fears were my identity. My worries were my personality. My self-criticism was my truth. I was completely merged with the mental activity, with no space, no distance, no separation at all. And because I was so completely identified with thinking, I had lost touch with the part of me that exists beneath thought, the awareness, the presence, the being that was here before language, before concepts, before the endless stream of mental commentary began. When I finally started to create space between myself and my thoughts, when I finally began to observe my thinking rather than being my thinking, I made a discovery that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. There was someone here beneath all the noise, someone quiet, someone still, someone who had been waiting patiently for me to notice her existence, my true self, not the self constructed by thoughts, not the self built from stories and beliefs and interpretations, but the self that simply is, that simply exists, that simply witnesses everything without needing to control it or understand it or judge it. And I grieved. I grieved for all the years I had lived without knowing this self existed. I grieved for all the peace I had missed. I grieved for all the time I had spent lost in my head, believing that the chaos up there was all I was. But I also felt something else, something that grew stronger with each passing day. Gratitude. Gratitude that I had finally found my way home, that I had finally discovered who I was beneath the thinking, that I still had time, still had years to live from this deeper place, to live as awareness instead of as thought, to live as presence instead of as mental noise. These 5 signs were my life for over 50 years, believing every thought, avoiding silence, having emotions controlled by mental activity rather than reality, arguing with what had already happened, forgetting who I was beneath the noise. And I share them with you not to create despair, but to create recognition. because you cannot change what you cannot see. You cannot free yourself from a prison you don't know you're in. But once you see these patterns, once you recognize them operating in your own life, you have something you didn't have before, a choice. The choice to question instead of believe. The choice to observe instead of obey. The choice to create space instead of staying merged. The choice to remember who you are beneath all the thinking. Before we part tonight, I want to ask you something. And I'm asking because I genuinely want to know. Which of these 5 signs resonates most deeply with you? Which pattern do you recognize in your own life? Where are you listening from right now? And what brought you to these words tonight? Leave your answer if you feel called to. Not because I need it, but because sometimes speaking a truth out loud, even to a stranger, is the first step in releasing its power over you. And because knowing you're not alone in this, knowing that others see what you see and feel what you feel, can be the beginning of everything. My name is Niran. I was controlled by my thoughts for most of my life. I believed them without question. I avoided silence because of them. I let them determine my emotions regardless of reality. I spent years arguing with what had already happened, and I forgot completely who I was beneath all the noise. But I found my way back, slowly, painfully, through years of sitting in the silence I had avoided, through years of questioning the thoughts I had always believed, through years of learning to observe instead of identify. And if I could find my way back after 50 years of being lost, you can too. You're already on the path. The fact that you're here, reading these words, asking these questions, means something in you knows there's more. Something in you remembers. And that something, that quiet knowing, is stronger than any thought. It's who you really are. And it's been waiting for you to come home.